Have you ever heard about a legal case that just doesn't make any sense? One where all the evidence points one way, but the final verdict goes in the complete opposite direction? Well, get ready because we are diving deep into one of those today. So here's the central mystery we're going to unpack. How on earth can a driver who blows more than twice the legal limit on a breathalyzer end up walking away not guilty? It sounds impossible, right? To figure it out, we've got to go right back to the beginning of that night. Okay, so let's set the scene. It's late January 24th, 2023. A 911 call comes in from a concerned citizen about a driver they think is seriously impaired. And that one call kicks off a chain of events that, trust me, nobody saw coming. And this all happens fast. Look at this timeline. The 911 call comes in at 11:55 p.m. Just 4 minutes later, at 11:59, the car is already parked in a driveway. The police get there only 11 minutes after that and make the arrest. You're going to want to keep this super tight timeline in mind because it becomes absolutely critical later on. So when the police show up and start talking to the driver, they're ticking all the boxes. We're talking a strong smell of alcohol, slurred speech, glossy eyes, you name it. They saw it. To them, the case against this guy is looking like a total slam dunk. But the real clincher, well, that was still to come. At this point, what the officers saw is pretty compelling. But what they really needed was cold, hard, scientific proof. So they take the driver down to the station for a breathalyzer test, and the result they get seems to seal the deal. 190. That was the result of the first breath test. 190 milligrams of alcohol in 100 milliliters of blood. A second test came in just a little lower at 180. Just let that number sink in for a second. 190. And just so we're all crystal clear on what that means, the legal limit is 80. This driver's blood alcohol level was more than double that. So with that kind of evidence, it's got to be an open and shut case, right? Wrong. This is where the whole story takes a very, very strange turn. Now, here's what's so wild. The defense team didn't argue about the breathalyzer results. They didn't say the machine was faulty or that the test was done wrong. No. Instead, their entire strategy was built around when the driver drank the alcohol. It's a strategy called the intervening drink defense. So what in the world is this defense? Well, it's pretty audacious. The argument is basically, yeah, okay, my client was extremely intoxicated when you tested him, but all of that drinking happened in the tiny sliver of time after he parked his car and before you cops showed up. It sounds completely unbelievable, but as it turns out, it's a real legal strategy with some very specific rules. Now, to successfully pull this off, you can't just say it. Under the law, you have to prove 3 things. 1, you drank after you stopped driving. 2, when you took that drink, you had no idea the police were about to show up and ask for a breath sample. And 3, this is the big one, that your story is consistent with having been under the legal limit at the actual time you were driving. Okay, so how did the defense even begin to try and prove all that? Well, it all came down to the driver's own story. A very precise, very specific account of what he drank and, more importantly, when. So here's the story he told. Before and during his drive, he said he'd only had 2 regular beers over about an hour. But, and here's the key, in that roughly 9-minute window between getting home and the police arriving, he claims he chugged an entire 375 milliliter bottle of whiskey, what a lot of people call a Mickey. And the craziest part, this wasn't some story his lawyers cooked up weeks later for the trial. Nope, this was what he told the police on the night he was arrested. That one admission, right then and there, became the cornerstone of his entire, seemingly impossible defense. Of course, a wild story is one thing, but you can't go into a courtroom and expect a judge to just take your word for it. The defense knew they had to show that this incredible scenario wasn't just a good story, but that it was scientifically plausible. To do that, they brought in the big guns, an expert witness, Dr. Michael Corbett, who is a forensic toxicologist. His entire job is to understand the science of how alcohol works in the human body. So Dr. Corbett's job was essentially to be a scientific time traveler. Using a process called retrograde extrapolation, he had to rewind the clock. He started with the one thing they knew for sure, that high breathalyzer reading at the station, and worked backwards to figure out what the driver's BAC would have been an hour earlier, at the exact moment he was driving. And what he found? Well, this is the bombshell that turned the whole case on its head. Dr. Corbett concluded that the driver's story, the 2 beers, and then chugging the Mickey, was scientifically not inconsistent with having a BAC below the legal limit of 80 while he was actually behind the wheel. In other words, the science said his story could be true. The massive spike in his blood alcohol came after he'd already parked the car. So, let's recap. On one side, you have police observations and a damning breathalyzer reading. On the other, you have a truly bizarre story that, somehow, is backed up by a toxicology expert. With all that on the table, what did the judge decide? Acquitted. The judge accepted the driver's story and the expert science. The charges were dismissed. He walked away. The defense successfully argued that the sky-high BAC reading had nothing to do with when he was driving and everything to do with the whiskey he drank in those few minutes after he got home. And this whole thing leaves us with a really fascinating question, doesn't it? Is the intervening drink defense a clever legal loophole that lets guilty people off the hook? Or is it a necessary safeguard, one that protects the fundamental idea that you can only be convicted for the crime the prosecution can actually prove, which in this case was being over the limit while driving, not an hour later in a police station? It's a debate that really gets to the core of how our justice system works.